한글마 구독자 여러분 안녕하세요. 오늘 저희가 굉장히 특별한 게스트를 모셨습니다. 한국에서는 닥터 둠이라는 닉네임으로 많이 알려졌던 분인데요. 2008년에 이 경제 위기를 정확히 예견하셨던 석학이시죠. 이 닥터 누리엘루비니 교수님을 모시고 오늘 좀 특별한 이야기를 나눠보려고 합니다.
사실은 본인께서는 리얼리스트라고 불리는 걸 더 선호하고 지금 앞으로 있을 세계의 큰 위협들 그리고 그 위협들이 하나로 뭉쳐질 수 있는 지금 절박한 상황에 와 있다라는 이야기를 또 해주시고 계시니까 이런 것들이 어떤 것들을 우리가 주의해야 또 사실은 또 우리가 어떤 것들을 어떻게 대처하는지가 중요하니까 그런 것들을 저희가 좀 오늘 여쭤보고 지혜를 얻을 수 있도록 해보겠습니다.
교수님께서 최근 출간하신 책의 제목이 이 초거대 위협인데요. 이 책의 내용을 함께 지금부터 이야기를 해보면서 우리를 잠재적으로 위협하고 있는 세계 경제의 리스크 요인들을 함께 점검해 보시면 좋을 것 같습니다.
It's an honor to be with you, Dr. Rubini, and we are facing global economic uncertainty. So for today's interview, we will discussing potential megathreats and seeking the right way to address them.
Yes, I just published a new book titled Megathreats, 10 Dangerous Trends that are imperiling our future and how to survive them. In this book, I talk not only about economic, monetary, and financial threats, but a number of ones that are also of another nature. They interact with the economic, monetary, and financial. Even the nature of the economic threat is today different from a few years ago. A couple of years ago, we were worrying that inflation in advanced economy was too low, below 2%. Now we're worried that inflation is too high, well above 2%. 2 years ago, we were worried about the risk of what people call a secular stagnation, too much savings, not enough consumption, weak economic growth, and low inflation or deflation. Now we're worried about the opposite, but stagflation, the risk of inflation and recession at the same time. 2 years ago, we were worried that interest rates were too low. There were zero policy rates, negative, quantitative easing and credit easing were leading to very low long-term interest rates, about $18 trillion equivalent of public debt between Europe and Japan had a negative nominal yield up to maturity of 10 years. But now that inflation has been rising, central banks have to increase interest rates, long-term interest is going higher, and now with a large stock of private and public debt, rising debt servicing ratios imply the risk of debt crisis. A couple of years ago, people were worried about the consequences of hyper-globalization. Now we're starting to worry about deglobalization, protectionism, restriction to trade of various sorts, decoupling, fragmentation of the global economy. And a couple of years ago, we had the everything bubble, every asset price all over the world was going higher. There was a boom and a bubble and an asset inflation. Today we have to worry about asset deflation, the fact that there's been a crash in US and global equity and a variety of other risky assets, including credit, real estate, and bond. So the nature of these economic, monetary, and financial risks is today different. And if we look at the non-economic ones, we have now a geopolitical depression. There is already a hot war between Russia and Ukraine. Could become unconventional, could involve NATO. Also recently in Israel, where it's clear that Iran has become a threshold nuclear state. And Israel will have to make tough decisions on whether to attack Iran or not. That could lead to a major spike in energy prices. Of course, the Cold War between US and China is becoming colder. Even a balloon is becoming a major escalation. Eventually, there could be even a military conflict on the issue of Taiwan. And finally, that little dictator in North Korea is not getting attention because attention is on Ukraine, on China, Taiwan, or Middle East. So he's launching rockets towards the seas near South Korea or Japan. And it's dangerous because now he has not only nuclear weapons, but also a variety of missiles that can deliver those weapons all over the world. So we have geopolitical risk. We have also global climate change that's becoming severely damaging all over the world, causing economic, fiscal, and a variety of social threats and costs. COVID-19 has taught us that pandemics, global pandemics, even severe ones, can occur. Unfortunately, COVID-19 is not going to be the last one. There'll be other ones, maybe more virulent. AI, machine learning, robotic, automation may increase the economic pie, but they may also lead to permanent technological unemployment for blue collars, white collars. They may also increase income and wealth inequality, as they are capital-intensive, skill-biased labor saving. And the political manifestation of these rise in income and wealth inequality, economic malaise for the middle class, for working class, young people who feel that their future is not going to be as good or worse than their parents, is a backlash against liberal democracy and democratic capitalism, and radical extremist populist parties of the right and or of the left are coming in power in a number of advanced economies and emerging markets. And all these threats are connected to each other. It's like a 10 by 10 matrix which each threat affects the other and vice versa. Now, I call them mega threats, but the Financial Times this year chose as one of the buzzwords of the year for last year the term poly-crisis, the same idea, economic and non-economic threats interacting with each other. I was in December presenting my book at the International Monetary Fund, discussing my book with the head of the IMF, the great, brilliant Miss Kristalina Georgieva. She wrote a speech speaking about a confluence of calamities like we have not seen since World War II. And I attended in January the World Economic Forum in Davos. They published their own annual global risk report, and it was all about mega threats, polycrisis, and economic, non-economic threats connected with each other. So whether you call it mega threats, or whether you call it polycrisis, or whether you call it a confluence of calamities, or whether, like the WEF, you say we'll have the most unstable and turbulent decades since World War II, is essentially different words that express the same kind of threats that we're facing today. That's why it's important to be aware of them so we can try to fix them over time.
Because of the name of the book, and some readers are worried about the current situation because you also predicted the 2008 the financial crisis. So you think this situation is even worse than the 2008, or just was there any motivation or any trigger that you published this book at this point?
By some dimension, this is worse because, first of all, the global financial crisis of 2008 was mostly an economic and a financial crisis. Now we're facing more existential threats that could threaten not only our economy, our savings, our wealth and jobs, but also our own planet, climate change, pandemic, or even the future of humanity if you had a nuclear winter, or eventually if AI were to make our species obsolete. But I think it's worse also because in the 1970s, those of us who are old enough to remember, there were two negative aggregate supply shocks, the Yom Kippur war between Israel and the Arab states, and Iran and Islamic Revolution in '79. They led to a shock to all prices, and we had inflation, recession, stagflation. By that time, the amounts of debts, private and public, globally as a share of GDP were very low, 100% of GDP. So US, Europe, Japan had inflation, recession, stagflation, but they did not have a debt crisis. After the global financial crisis, we had debt problems, household debt, mortgage debt, housing debt, bank debt, so you had a debt crisis, but the shock was a demand shock, it was a credit crunch, and we ended up with deflation or lowflation, so central banks could do massive monetary and credit easing, and we had the fiscal stimulus. Today, in some sense, we have the worst of the 70s because we have a whole series of negative aggregate supply shocks that are stagflationary, but we also have the worst of the post-global financial crisis period because now debt ratios are even higher than they were, 350% of GDP and rising than they were 15 years ago during the global financial crisis. I would say things are even worse than the 1930s that were the prelude for World War II. because today we have this geopolitical depression. But if you think about it, you know, the period between 1914 and 45, where 30 years were terrible. World War I, Spanish flu, stock market crash of 29, Great Depression, inflation, deflation, hyperinflation, trade wars, currency wars, financial crisis, debt crisis, defaults, unemployment above 20%. And then you have the rise to power of authoritarian militaristic regimes, Nazis in Germany, fascists in Italy, Franco in Spain, and of course militarists in Japan. And then we had the World War II and we had the Holocaust. But today, there are some mega threats that did not even exist in these 30 awful years. They were awful by any chance. You know, in that time, we didn't have to worry about climate change. It was not an issue. We didn't have to worry about AI destroying jobs. There was not even a computer, let alone AI. Yeah. We didn't have to worry about implicit debt coming from aging of population. US had just created Social Security, and the average worker would die at the age of 60 before even the first check from Social Security would come at 62. And finally, as ugly as World War I and World War II were, there were conventional conflicts, and only at the end of World War II, we're lucky that US got the nuclear bomb rather than Nazi Germany, and unfortunately, US had to use it in Nagasaki, Hiroshima at the end of World War II. But if today there was a war between great powers, and you have a number of revisionist powers that are China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, now Pakistan, they all are nuclear powers. And if a conventional war were to occur among them, US, Europe, and the West, and their allies, that war is not going to remain conventional. It's going to escalate, of course, in an unconventional war that could lead to a nuclear winter, to a good chunk of humanity dying. So I would say we have the worst of the 70s, we have the worst of the post-global financial crisis period, and because of the geopolitical depression, it's worse than the 1930s.
Yeah, it resembles the past, and also there have been many events that can be considered black swans nowadays. So could this be seen as signs to mega threats, or do you believe the black swans have some correlations between the events?
You know, it's a little bit how we define, of course, black swans. You know, the former Secretary of Defense of the US that said there are known knowns. We know who's president in the US or Korea today. We know there'll be election in the United States at the end of next year. Those are known knowns. Then there are known unknowns. And the kind of mega threats I talk about are known uncertainties, right? Risk of economic, financial crisis, climate change, war amongst nations, AI, whatever. Those are all risks that are known. And then he said there are also known unknowns, or sorry, unknown unknowns. Unknown unknowns are really true black swan events, stuff that nobody could have predicted. For example, 9/11, almost nobody saw it coming. Global pandemic, some people, scientists were saying it was going to happen, but it was a surprise. Now, in my book, I'm not talking about, say, the risk of the Earth being taken over by aliens or an asteroid hitting planet Earth. Maybe those are unknown unknowns, even if some scientists worry about them. I'm speaking all about what I would call known unknowns, sources of risk, uncertainty that can affect our economic and social future. Because we live in a world of what I call unexpected, unusual, unprecedented uncertainty for use. And we live in this world of uncertainty, volatility, risk, threats, potential instability, and chaos. But most of these threats are sort of known. You know, there are thousands of books written about climate change, about pandemic, about AI, about geopolitical risk. Maybe my contribution of my book is that I connect the dots. I show how all of these factors affect each other and vice versa. So it's a system, they're not separate silos. And two, I try to take a view of what are the economic implications of the non-economic threats and how the economy interacts with social, political, geopolitical, environmental, health, and technological threats and how they're related to each other. So in that sense, I'm not sure if these are black swan events as opposed to white swan events, meaning I think of them as being known unknowns as opposed to truly unknown unknowns.
Yeah, thank you. And now let's talk about the topic by topic. So I want to talk about the inflation first, and which is the biggest problem in the United States and the worldwide. So in your book, you criticize the Jerome Powell's policy. And in fact, recent high CPI and strong consumer spending lends weight to the argument that inflation may not be easily tamed. How do you evaluate the Fed policy direction related to the rate hike, and what is your view on how much inflation will ease this year, and what is the reason for your view?
Yes, the rise in inflation, both in advanced economies, but also in some important emerging market since COVID, the last couple of years, of course, has been caused by a combination of bad policies and bad luck. Bad policy was excessively loose monetary, fiscal, and credit policy and easing. We needed it during COVID, but the size of it was excessive compared to the shock of COVID that was contained into time. And of course, all these stimulus eventually caused initially asset inflation, but then given the restriction to supply and too much demand causes goods and service inflation. There was also bad luck because there were a series of negative aggregate supply shock that hit the global economy. First one was, of course, the initial impact of COVID on production of goods and services, shutting down economic activity, reducing the supply of labor, and disrupting global supply chains. The second one was, of course, the impact of the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine on commodity prices, oil, natural gas, food, fertilizer, and industrial metals. And three, until recently, the zero COVID policy of China also created further bottlenecks in production and in global supply chains. Now, inflation went higher. Central banks started to raise interest rates to fight inflation. Inflation in the last few months has peaked in US, in Europe, advanced economies, and also emerging markets. It's starting to fall. People are optimistic and say we'll be able to go back to, say, the target of 2% inflation without causing a hard landing, meaning without having a recession. I'm skeptical. I'm of the view that we'll have a hard landing. You know, in US history, there's never been a case where inflation is above 5% right now, depending on how you measure it, 6, 7, and unemployment is below 5%, and today is 3.5. That when that happens and the Fed raises rates, you get a soft landing. You always get a hard landing, first point. Secondly, in my view, pushing inflation down from around 8% or 10% towards 5, 6 is easy with tighter monetary policy. There are many reasons why inflation is going to remain sticky. It's going to be sticking around 4 or 5 rather than moving towards 2%. First reason has to do with commodity prices. This geopolitical depression implies that the war between Russia and Ukraine is going to get worse with further shocks to commodity prices. 2, there's a meaningful chance that Israel is going to strike Iran this year because of the nuclear threat. That will be a shock to energy prices. 3, while China has phased out zero COVID, now everybody's getting sick in China, so many people cannot work in factories, truckers cannot drive. That creates supply bottlenecks. And if eventually China were to be successful to get herd immunity, then growth will accelerate maybe this year to 5% rather than 3%, but demand for commodity is going to go higher. On the commodity side also, there is massive underinvestment now in new capacity for commodities. In energy, because we're bashing fossil fuel producer, shareholders, stakeholder, financial institutions say don't invest in new capacity. And for green metal, industrial metal, in spite of high prices, regulation, environmental issues imply there has not been investment in new capacity. So you have lack of supply, you have geopolitical factors, you have demand Goldman Sachs expect that this year commodity prices are going to go up overall between energy, food, green metal, industrial metal, fertilizer, 43%. Now, even if it was only 30% or 20 or 25, with commodity prices rising, inflation is not going to go down, headline is going to go higher, and core also is going to go higher. Two, in advanced economies, we have very tight labor markets. Unemployment rate is historically low in US, but also in Europe. You have aging of population. You have restriction to migration. You have the great resignation. You have falling labor force participation rate in the US. You have early retirement. You have a job skills mismatch. Many people don't have, because of the poor education in US, the skills for the jobs of the future. And now there's a beginning of strike and labor strife because wages have been growing less than inflation, real wages have been falling. So you see beginning of strikes and labor unrest in Europe and US. So inflation of wages is about 5–6%. To have inflation at 2, you need wage inflation of 3. 1% for productivity and 2% then for inflation. If it's 5–6, that consistent with inflation at 5, not at 2. Final point, goods inflation might be falling because now there has been some softening for now in commodity prices and some supply bottlenecks are eased. But 3/4 of most economies services, and the main cost of production in services is labor. And if wage inflation is going to be 5–6, service inflation is going to remain high. So if I'm right, the view of central banks that core inflation is going to fall by the end of this year to 3% and reach 2% by the end of next year is not correct. Core inflation is going to stick around 4–5-ish, even at the end of this year. And then central banks will be in a dilemma. Either the Fed increases interest rates not to 5, but all the way to 6 or above. Either the ECB increases interest rates not to 3%, but to 4% or above. But if they go to 6 or 4, then you have a real recession and you have a crash in equity prices, in bonds, and in credit. So you have a hard landing of the real economy and a financial crash that makes a recession worse. And a worse recession leads to more defaults. And then you have an economic and financial crash. Or if central banks then were to wimp out and blink and say, okay, we don't want to cause economic financial crash, then inflation expectation get de-anchored, wage inflation becomes higher, and then you end up into a wage price spiral like the 70s. You end up with high inflation, recession, still stagflation. So them if you do and them if you don't. So my baseline is still a hard landing rather than a soft landing or a short and shallow recession that is the softish landing view of many people in the markets.
You mentioned the recession and hard landing, and you mentioned some clue in your statement, but let me check one thing. Let's focus on the definition of recession. The one condition of recession should be a labor market, but recently we checked some data. At least the U.S. labor market is unpredictably robust. And do you believe that the trend will going to be collapsed too soon? You mean in this year or later this year?
Yeah, we're not yet in a recession in US. We're not yet in a recession in Europe. And a recession is defined as at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. When that happens on a persistent basis, there is job losses and there is a rise in unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate goes higher. So the labor market also starts to suffer. So far, both US and Europe have avoided the recession. There's been a slowdown of economic growth as central banks have tightened monetary policy, and you have fiscal restraint, credit tightening, and there are negative supply shocks. We already see the beginning of softening the labor market in, say, the tech sector. Many of these tech firms, even the big tech ones, have started to firing people. But those are more forward-looking indicators. So the real hard economic data have been stronger than the soft data that are more the survey forward-looking. But the forward-looking suggests a significant deceleration of economic growth. And of course, financial condition last year tightened with equity prices falling, bond yields going higher, credit spreads widening, and also some of the strength of the dollar was a tightening of financial condition for the US. So I see this hard landing now materializing this year. As I said, in January and February of this year, markets rallied, bond yields fell because there was a hope that we avoid a hard landing, inflation drops, we still have growth, and the market were rallying on that. But I think that the last couple of weeks, people have realized inflation is going to be more persistent. The Fed is not going to stop at 4.75. It's not going to stop even at 5.25 now. Goldman, Bank of America said they're going to go to 5.5. I believe they have to go to 6. And same thing in Europe. Market thought the ECB would stop below 3 and then they cut rate in the second half. Now, no, they're not going to go even to 3.25. They have to go towards 3.5 or 4. And there's no way they can cut rates this year, given that the labor market is tight. So now the markets are starting to get nervous again. Equity markets down, bond yields higher because there's a sense the soft landing scenario was too optimistic.
And about the recession, also you mentioned about the stagflation in your book, and how do you think that there's a possibility of stagflation in this year or in the near term? Is there any possibility?
Well, if I'm right that we're going to have a hard landing and you'll have a recession at least 2 quarters or more, while inflation is above target, the definition of stagflation is when you have a recession and inflation above target. We're already there in the United Kingdom where you have inflation closer to 10 and a recession that the Bank of England expects to be at least 4 to 6 quarters. But in the book I make the argument that even if some of the negative supply shock that led us to stagflationary situation in the short run were to be easing, say maybe eventually the war between Russia and Ukraine is going to end, maybe, I don't think anytime soon. Maybe now COVID is behind us and supply bottlenecks are going to be in the past. Maybe the zero COVID policy of China is phased out and China can grow. Even if this were to happen, in the book I identify 10 medium-term negative aggregate supply shock that reduce potential growth, increase cost of production, that are stagflationary, and then if you have over medium-term loose monetary and fiscal policy, they still need to stagflation. Now, I don't have time to go in detail on each one of them, but if I had to summarize, deglobalization and protectionism is stagflationary. Reshoring of manufacturing from low-cost China to high-cost Europe or US, or even friendshoring is going to imply cost. We talk about secure trade rather than free trade, friendshoring rather than offshoring. Now just in case rather than just in time, global supply chains have become redundant and more costly. We have aging of population, not only US, Europe and Japan, but in China, in Russia, in South Korea, in Taiwan. We have now restriction of migration from south to north, from poor to rich, that kept a lead on wage growth in advanced economies. We have this geopolitical depression and decoupling between US and China, but even more between the West and these rival powers. Is going to fragment and balkanize and decouple the global economy. We have, of course, the effects of climate change. Even before Russian invasion of Ukraine, food prices are high because lack of water, desertification, spike of prices, or we bash fossil fuel producers because they underinvest, and Brent was $100 per barrel or before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Then, as we know, pandemics cause supply shock that are stagflationary. In the future, we'll have also cyber warfare that damages production, or firms have to spend a fortune to protect themselves. And there are 2 final factors: a backlash against income and wealth inequality, and now is leading to fiscal policy, pro-labor, pro-union, pro-worker, pro-minorities, pro-unemployed, pro-partially employed people. Rightly so, because otherwise we're going to have social unrest, but that's going to increase wage growth and the reservation wage. And finally, we're also rightly using the dollar, the euro, as weapons of foreign policy and national security. We're weaponizing them, imposing trade and financial sanctions against Russia, China, our rivals, Korea, Iran. But weaponizing the dollar implies, 1, the risk of a disorderly fall of the dollar, and 2, you're creating sand in the wheel, friction and cost in the international payment system that requires free use of the dollar for trading goods and services, in movement of capital, investment, labor, data, technology, information, that's also as a friction stagflationary. So there are 10 forces that over the medium term, slow motion, reduce potential growth, increase cost of production, and that could lead to medium-term stagflation.
Thank you. And this would be the last question about inflation. And in your book, you insisted that we need to focus on the lowflation, which means then that less than 2%. But the majority of the central banks in worldwide, they target around 2% inflation rate per year. So do you think that we need an inflation target that is even lower than the 2%? And what is your view about the lowflation?
Well, until 2 years ago, inflation was persistently below 2%. Some economists, not me, suggested that the new normal for inflation, say in Japan, was not 2%, and the Bank of Japan should accept either a zero inflation target or 1%, because trying to achieve 2 when the various technological, demographic factors were leading to something close to zero implied loose monetary policy eventually would create financial and economic instability. Today is the opposite. Since inflation is well above 2%, a number of economists say that maybe the 2% inflation target is obsolete. We should accept 4 or more. The problem with going from 2 to 4 de jure, meaning formally, is that once you change your inflation target from 2 to 4, how do you know that inflation expectations are going to get anchored to 4, as opposed to people say maybe 5 or 6 or 10? In the 1970s, where the stagflationary shock, monetary credit and fiscal policy were behind the curve, and from inflation of 2-3%, we ended up with 10, 12, even 15. So changing your inflation target risks to the anchor inflation expectation, risk leading to a wage and price spiral, and then you don't go from 2 to 4, you risk going from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 to you don't know what's the limit. So I think that the idea when inflation was below 2 to go to a target of 0 was not a good idea. And now the idea that inflation is above 2 to have a formal target of 4, I think is also a bad idea. Of course, I think that central banks de facto, not formally de jure, are going to accept higher inflation. They're not going to say we accept a higher target, but if I'm right, then going to 2% inflation causes an economic and financial crash, then the cost will be so severe that they themselves, let alone the political pressure, is going to lead them to accept a higher inflation rate, but informally, not formally. But then if you accept a higher inflation rate, as I pointed out, you can have a de-anchoring of inflation expectation, and you could end up like the 70s, well above 4. That's the risk. So damn if you do and damn if you don't. If you fight inflation, you have a hard landing and financial crash. If you don't fight inflation, you have the anchoring and high inflation, and then with negative supply shocks, still recession and stagflation. So we're already at a point of no return that the mistakes were done in the past, and given high debt, given the need to monetize it, and given the supply shocks, we end up in a bad equilibrium regardless of.
Thank you. And before we move on to another topic, let me ask just one thing, and this is like that. Stock market analysts and investors judge the current and future market condition by economic data they get. Nevertheless, they often get it wrong. So, in your opinion, what are the economic indicators that mesmerize or deceive investors?
Well, you know, it may be an issue of what are the important economic data that one should follow, but those important data may change over time. They're not always the same, even if, of course, measure of slack or tightness in goods and labor market are important. In the past, we used to have more demand shock or positive supply shock, like globalization, trade, migration, technology. Now we have to think about the negative supply shock and how they can lead to stagflation. But also, you know, our economic model often don't work. You know, typical economic model doesn't predict a financial crisis or recession. The structure of the global economy is changing. How do you incorporate financial risks? How do you incorporate geopolitical risks? It's very hard to put these things in the economic model. So I think you have to be open-minded. You have to look at everything. You have to look not only at the economic factors, because The other ones, as I said, politics, geopolitics, environment, climate change, pandemics, technology are becoming important. So you have to be the holistic approach, not having particular ideology or a model that's not going to work, and probably having a more systematic, holistic approach of understanding world and all this interaction. You can make sense of whether we're going in the one direction or going in another direction. So there's no perfect data, there's no perfect model.
Thank you. And let's check some geopolitical conflict and derivative things. You mentioned the geopolitical conflict. The most thing will be US and China conflict. And it is an issue that South Korea is closely monitoring because these two countries are its largest importers. So if the conflict between them intensifies, could you please advise what perspective or strategy we should take or we should adopt in this situation?
Yeah, you know, things are sensitive for Korea because Korea is a small open economy, depends on global trade, depends on global growth, depends also on Chinese growth. Korea, like Taiwan, is also a major producer of semiconductors. And, you know, if there was eventually an armed conflict between US and China on the issue of Taiwan, half of all semiconductors in the world are produced by Taiwan, 80% of the high-end, and of course Samsung and other Korean are also very important producer of semiconductors. And of course, if there was a conflict in the peninsula with this crazy dictator in Pyongyang really attacking, then that will be also economic and trade and financial and technological shock to South Korea. And you know, Korea is also complicated. On one side is a friend and an ally of the United States, but also does a lot of trade and investment with China. So, and that's a predicament that many of the friends and allies of the US have, say Europe, politically, geopolitically in the West, but then lots of trade, investment, FDI, exports to China. Same thing for Gulf nations. You know, in an ideal world, we have a Cold War gets colder, but we don't have a real military conflict. But even if you avoid an outright war, I think that increasingly both the US and China are going to tell their friends and allies, either you're with me or against me. And especially on the issue of technology, going to become sensitive. Say, US now has declared a technological war against China by saying that the exports of high-end chip semiconductors, but not only semiconductors, but also semiconductor equipment is forbidden to China, and not only stuff that is produced by US, but even anything that has US design that goes in the production of semiconductor or semiconductor equipment is forbidden. And you know, while US doesn't produce a lot of chips at home, is Taiwan, is Japan, is of course Korea, the design of many of these semiconductors has some inputs from the US. So as long as there is input for US, then you're not allowed to sell it, the high-end one at least, to China. So that's for national security reasons. Or on 5G, the US said, you know, the 5G of Huawei is a backdoor to the Chinese government, so you should not use 5G of Huawei for your telecom. But you know, today is your cell phones can be a backdoor to the Chinese government. But say tomorrow, it's not going to be only a question of electric vehicles. Eventually, we have autonomous vehicle. An autonomous vehicle is not mostly the hardware, it's more the software. You're going to need all the sensors to collect all the big data that AI, machine learning, together with 5G and 6G, make sure that millions of autonomous cars can move together without hitting each other. Now, would the Chinese allow a Western AI-based software for autonomous vehicle to run their transportation system? Of course not. And would the West allow a Chinese software to allow their transportation system? No, because you know, either the US can stop the Chinese or vice versa. So the point is, once you have a technological decoupling, we'll have technological decoupling. It starts with telecom, it starts with cell towers, it starts with cell phones, but then it goes to autonomous vehicle. But tomorrow, every piece of even low-end consumer electronic is going to have a 5G chip. Your Chinese toaster, your Chinese coffee machine, your Chinese microwave. So if you worry that your phone is a listening device for the Chinese CCP, your toaster can be a listening device, not only the drone or the web camera, whatever, even a toaster or a coffee machine. So once you go, as you will, technological decoupling, that's going to happen for sure, because we're not going to use Chinese technology, we're not going to use ours. It's not just phones, it's not just autonomous vehicles. Every literally goods and service, even this bottle could have a chip, 5G, because in the Internet of Things, to have global supply chains of tracking wherever good and service is, even a bottle might have a 5G chip and it could be a listening device. So when you start with technological decoupling, you can decouple for every good and service. And then you have a really divided world where the allies of the US, whether it's Europe or Korea, unfortunately cannot do business with US and Europe and with China. They'll have to choose whether on one side or the other, because that decoupling is decoupling for pretty much every technology, every good, every service. Eventually, I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but that's a trend.
So we have to choose at least one thing at some point, do you think so?
I think it will be a decoupled world where US, Europe, the West, their friends and allies in Asia, in Latin America, in other parts of the world, they'll have a economic, monetary, trading, technological, financial, political, geopolitical system that is integrated. And then China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, Cambodia, and probably some other emerging markets, poor countries are going to say, we're going to go with China. There'll be a very decoupled world. So, say, Europe now discovered the risk of being dependent on energy from Russia, but now Europe will have to start to think about what the risk of being dependent on exports of foreign direct investment in China. Because if this Cold War gets colder, even Europe will have to choose between US and China, and I think they'll have to choose US, because if they want the US to protect them from the Russian bear, then NATO has to protect US and NATO interests also in Asia. And Korea and Japan and so on, already NATO is moving to Asia. You have the Quad with Japan, India, Australia, and US. You have the AUQS, that is US, Australia, UK, with the submarine and so on. And Korea is of course a friend ally of the United States. I think that even some of the tensions between Japan and Korea will have to be resolved, because the Chinese threat is a common threat both to China and to Korea, more than their own historical differences and grievances. So we'll be in a divided world where people probably be completely different systems. There'll be real significant decoupling with completely different separate economic areas. I think eventually we may go in that direction.
Even though the US dollar is currently weakened, but it's just still the most important and the biggest currency in the world. But the China is trying to just buy some commodities in the Chinese yuan instead of the dollars. So what do you expect the future of the dollars, and what the currency will go, and how will it affect the US economy and the worldwide economy?
Well, since World War II, we had a unipolar global currency system where about 2/3 of all transactions, either unit of account, means of payment, store of value, vehicle currency, are dollar related. Of course, there were other reserve currencies, the euro, the yen, the pound, the Swiss franc, and slowly a little bit of RMB. And in a world before this geopolitical depression, people tried to build a multipolar currency system. You had the IMF SDR. There was mostly advanced economies, but then they added in the last decade the RMB. But the SDR never, flew in as something that people were using. But now in a world that's going to be divided in two, where there is these fragmented two sides of the world with different economic, monetary, trading, financial, political, geopolitical system, probably the Chinese will be successful in building the RMB as a reserve currency, unit of account, means of payment, store of value, first for their friends and allies. They have to also diversify from dollar assets that may be subject to sanction. And maybe they'll be able to convince the Gulf country to say, hey, when I buy your oil, why don't we price it in RMB? Why I don't pay you in RMB? Why don't you use more RMB among your reserves? And you know, some of this Gulf economy may be sympathetic to do some of their trade in RMB, and some poor country and emerging markets are going to accept RMB as a reserve currency. Of course, China can also provide them their e-commerce and payment system, globalize them, Alipay, WeChat Pay, also their technology in 5G, and also their own surveillance system, right? You know, China is a very broader society where technology, even financial technology, is allowed to control what people do and have a social credit rating system. And for a bunch of authoritarian countries like in the world, the Chinese model of surveillance, you know, state capitalist, authoritarian state is going to be appealing to them, not to the West, not to their friends and allies, not to the democracies in Asia. So you know, in that world, probably it's not the decline absolute of the dollar, is relative. There'll be a world that used to be unipolar, never became multipolar, and it's going to become bipolar, where you have two economic systems, two financial trading systems, and two monetary currency systems, where for most of the world it's still the US dollar, but for some parts of the world, the area of influence of China, the Chinese currency is going to become a more important global reserve currency. So yeah, we'll have gradual de-dollarization, not disappearance of the dollar, but gradual de-dollarization, a bipolar system. I think that's quite likely over the next few decades. Those things don't happen overnight.
Let's talk about another severe problem, both for the United States and Korea. The aging population problem is a significant social issue in Korea too, like United States, but both countries are conservative to the migration policies. So, and it's not easy to increase the working age population without the migration. So, if we don't accept the immigration, that if we cannot increase the people who are working in the country, so what would you think, and what would you suggest for the migration policy for the United States and both of the country, I mean, including Korea?
Yeah, aging of population becomes a challenge for a number of reasons. Reason number one is potential growth depends on population growth. Everything else equal, lower population growth implies lower potential growth. Two, in aging of population, you get implicit debt, unfunded liabilities, because you have a pension system and healthcare system for the aging. This is financed by payroll taxes on the young. If you have less young workers to provide the payroll taxes to give the benefits to the old, then you get a problem that those benefits eventually become non-sustainable. And implicit debt, 100% of GDP in advanced economies, is as high as the official public debt, so that's a time bomb. And also, a lot of technological innovation is embedded in new capital. If you have lower population, you have less capital investment, and therefore less innovation that is embodied in capital. Now, in the past, the migration, at least to Europe, US, was part of the solution. Now, for a bunch of social, political reasons, restriction, and of course, some societies like Japan or Korea, traditionally, they did not have as many migrants to begin with. But I would say that in the past, aging was a problem because you needed more workers, and migration was a solution for those countries that accepted it. But in a world in which there'll be AI, machine learning, robotic, and automation, a lot of jobs are going to disappear. Demand for labor is going to be reduced, and you'll have permanent technological unemployment because of first blue-collar jobs, then white-collar jobs, eventually even creating jobs being replaced by machines. So in some sense, there'll be another reason why you don't want migrants, because there are not going to be even enough jobs for the local people, let alone for foreigners. So I think there'll be even tighter migration policies. So we always have to make sure we don't fight the wars of the past In the past was the question, how can we grow fast enough with aging and not enough migrants? Tomorrow is going to be how we're going to be able to grow and get jobs to everybody, even without migration, in a world where technology makes many jobs obsolete. So there'll be even more restriction, of course, to migration. Now, you know, in some societies, like in Japan, they're already using robots to take care of the elderly. There are these robots that are caregivers of one sort or another. So you can resolve that one if you need the jobs for caring of the elderly and so on. And actually, some of these robots are more emotionally intelligent than humans because, you know, if you're sad, they recognize you and make a sad face and they say, what's wrong with you? Many humans actually don't have that emotional intelligence to recognize somebody is sad or unhappy. So even those caregiving jobs probably can be eventually taken over by technology. And then how we deal with the disruption that AI does on jobs, it's another big issue, and that is another problem. You know, I was once in Korea and I was speaking with the head of one of the major car companies in Korea. This was a few years ago, before COVID. He told me, listen, we do have today the technology that allows us, our factories, to be almost completely automated, say 90% robots and machines doing the jobs with very, very few workers. Why don't we do it? We don't do it because, of course, unions are strong, and socio-politically, if you had to fire most workers, there'll be a social crisis. So we cannot actually adopt this technology now because there'll be the serious disruption to the job. This was 5 years ago. And since then, of course, the revolution in AI, machine learning, robotic automation has only accelerated. So eventually, if you want to be competitive, if you're not using robots for creating your cars, somebody else will. And if you have high labor cost, eventually you're not competitive. So there'll be a race to automate production of cars, but pretty much of everything else. You know, the factory of the future is going to be 1,000 robots, maybe one man or a woman manning that robot, and then another person cleaning the floor. But you can already today use a Roomba robot to clean the floor, and that Roomba robot doesn't take a vacation, doesn't have benefits, doesn't have a bathroom break. So, and that's why, you know, even cleaning the floor is going to be cheaper with a machine that does it rather than a human, right? These Roomba robots that do it all by themselves without any use of labor.
But your concern is based on this idea that the technology will substitute the traditional job and it's going to be disappear and many people get lost their jobs. But there's another thing. When we focus about the productivity, that means like AI. So there have been another attempt to solve the population gets down the productivity issues by improving labor productivity with cutting-edge technology like AI. It could change, it could produce another jobs. So maybe there's, how can I say, but maybe your concern will be solved by the progress of the cutting-edge technology. What do you think about that kind of view?
Well, I do agree that eventually these technological innovation are going to increase productivity growth. They're going to increase rapidly the economic pie, potential growth, say in US and Europe is 1 to 2%, could come 3, 4, 5, even 6. That will happen, but first I fear that we'll still have a permanent technological unemployment. First for blue-collar jobs, because most of it can be automated, but now you also discovered that many of these white-collar jobs, they can be sliced in a series of tasks, and all these tasks can be automated. But now with advanced generative AI, ChatGPT, even what were called the creative jobs, you know, maybe eventually substituted by technology. I'll give you one example, you know. I don't only write about what the world is going to be in the next 20 years, you know. I have an economic consultancy. I'm a Fed watcher. I'm an ECB watcher. So I'm trying to predict every few weeks what the Fed, ECB will do. And my clients want to know that. Now, for now, an ECB watcher or Fed watcher can do it better than AI. And actually, if you take a Fed watcher at Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, they have a PhD, they get paid $1 million a year. Those are really excellent jobs because, you know, if you can predict what the Fed does, you can make a lot of money for your clients. These are the best jobs on Wall Street by some standard. Not the best, but they're definitely among highest paid. Yeah. Now, it's not yet today, but 3 or 4 years from now, there'll be an AI that looks at all economic data, all economic models, looks at every speech and statement by a Fed official, FMC, looks at the reaction function historically, looks at all the economic and other shocks, and it's going to make a prediction of what the Fed is going to decide, not just the decision, but what's going to be the statement of the FMC, the words of it, and what will be the words of Powell during the press conference, because it's not just the decision, but also the statement and the press that affects market prices. I don't know if it's going to take 3 years or 4 or 5. It's going to happen. And then that $1 million job of a Fed watcher at Goldman is going to be gone. I mean, we're at this level that eventually the technology disrupts not only, you know, traditional white-collar, blue-collar jobs, but also the best jobs. And technology is capital-intensive, skill-biased, and labor-saving. So if you own the machines or the capital owns the machine, of course, you get the high returns. If you're in the top 10, 15% of distribution of skills, education, human capital, for a while, the AI is going to make you more productive. You're a lawyer, investment banker, economist, a doctor, whatever. Initially, your productivity increases and your income increases. But if you are blue-collar worker or white-collar worker, low value added, medium value added, over time, gradually, your jobs and your income is going to be displaced by technology. It's going to increasingly so. Now, people say there'll be jobs of the future, but you know, when productivity in agriculture rose, people moved to industry. And when the productivity in industry rose, we went to services, but now even services can be automated. People say there'll be new jobs of the future, but you know, for every job created by Amazon, there are 10 jobs in retail are going to disappear. And as I said, even the jobs that people say only human can do, caregiving for the sick or for the elderly, robots in Japan are more emotionally intelligent than the typical human being. Plus, you know, the guys who lost in America their jobs in manufacturing, what they became? They became Uber drivers, or they became cashiers at the supermarket, or they became hamburger flippers at McDonald's. But today, tomorrow, autonomous vehicle, Uber jobs are gone. Hamburger flippers, there are robots who can do, you know, the burgers, or can do even a cappuccino 5 times faster than every worker. And you go to every store these days, you can order, you know, your food or your order with an iPad. And then if you do a supermarket, you check out, there's no more cashier, right? People do the self-checkout. So even those jobs, they were service jobs, low-end, low value added, low wages, much lower wages than industry. Even those jobs, technology is going to make it disappear. So where are all these new jobs of the future that people are going to do? People talk about them, but realistically, even the low value added, low end service jobs will be gone. And tomorrow, not only have autonomous vehicle, but there'll be some drone that takes your, you know, McDonald's order and delivers it to your home. Or be a robot delivering it. You don't even need the autonomous vehicle. Even the jobs of journalists will be threatened.
So, yeah,
There's already, you know, company financial report comes out, and AI can take the pro forma statement and convert it into an article, because, you know, it's some data. It's already happening now, slowly but surely, right?
Right, yeah. So in your book, and you mentioned that the optimists still believe that inflation can be tamed by this type of the technological innovation, but then you don't believe that this kind of innovation will help the disinflation. So how would it just affect to the inflation or the product price?
Well, I do believe that long-term technological innovation, AI, is going to increase the economic pie and is going to collapse the cost of production of many goods and services. However, over the next decade, as I pointed out, there are at least 10 forces that are stagflationary: reduce potential growth, increase cost of production, and they lead to stagflation. and there's only one force in the past years that was leading to good deflation. That was essentially technology. So eventually technology is going to cause this deflation, but we're going to pass through a phase of 10, maybe 20 years or more stagflationary forces. And two, as I said, technology is occurring, but we don't see it yet in the productivity numbers. Some people are technological pessimists. I'm not. I believe that takes a lag between the time where you do innovation and you spread them to every sector with B2B and B2C application. It was like the first internet revolution. Only over time it led to more growth and less inflation. So eventually, yeah, we'll have a big technological deflation, but it's going to go through first 10, 20 years of stagflation.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And let's move on to another question. There's another issue is becoming some hot. It's like the debt ceiling in U.S. So debt ceilings are once again becoming U.S. hot issue. While there's a political conflicts, but I think it is reasonable to assume that debt ceiling will be solved because they want to avoid default eventually. However, the more fundamental problem is, I think, debt itself, that people are ignoring the fact that debt itself. What do you think about the U.S. debt? Is it okay to just watching it, or is there any solved problem to the increasing debt?
Yeah, no, I do agree with you. You know, every time there's a debt limit fight, Democrats and Republicans have a fight. There's this kabuki theater drama, and then they avoid default because, you know, neither side wants to really default. So we'll have the same saga, and at the 11th hour, you're going to find an agreement. But, you know, the U.S. debt ratio today, private and public, is higher than after World War II, is higher than during the peak of the Great Depression, and we're not coming out of another Great Depression. We're not coming out of a major global war. So this debt ratio have become higher and higher. Now, the US is lucky. Being the global reserve currency, it has what people call exorbitant privilege. People buy treasury and dollar assets, and therefore the US can run large current account fiscal deficit for longer and cheaper than if the US was not a reserve currency. Two, while US has a debt problem, I would say the problem in Europe and Japan are bigger because one, they have a more aging of population than US, and their potential growth, given being technological and not as advanced as US, are greater than the US. So if you worry about unsustainable debt in the US, you should worry even more so about unsustainable debt in many parts of Europe or Japan. But eventually, of course, even the US could have a problem. One, because as I pointed out, you could have a process of de-dollarization, and people may move away from dollar assets, so that exorbitant privilege may go away. And especially because the US can finance itself so cheaply, then that leads to even more debt accumulation, because, right, the exorbitant privilege means that the rest of the world give us more rope and we can hang ourselves. So it takes longer to hang ourselves, but once we hang ourselves, it's going to be uglier because we'll have even more debt, private, public, domestic, and foreign, than any other country. Usually in other countries, typical emerging market, you have too much debt, say Korea in '97, you have a debt crisis, so you have to clean yourself because the market, through discipline, doesn't allow you to borrow more. So credit crunch, you adjust, and then you reform. In the US, you don't adjust, and the world keeps on financing you because of exorbitant privilege, so the debt bomb becomes bigger, and then once the debt becomes really unsustainable, there's shock to the dollar, the crash could be more severe than Europe and Japan, where eventually the market discipline occurs sooner.
Will it be connected, as you predicted, the era of decoupling?
It could be many shocks. You know, decoupling means that China, that holds at least $1 trillion of the reserves in US Treasury, may want to diversify away because, you know, as the Russia conflict shows, you can seize those, freeze those assets. Typical argument is, if I owe you $1 billion, is my problem. If I owe you $1 trillion, is your problem because I can always default or seize it. So China wants to move away from those dollar assets. Maybe in gold or other things cannot be seized. If that were to happen, you could have a spike in treasury yields that makes the cost of borrowing for the US higher. It's not just China, but the other strategic rivals. Could be gradual de-dollarization for other reasons. It could be that because exactly we can borrow so cheaply for so longer that we actually, our twin fiscal and current account deficits are much larger than those of other countries. So, you know, in Europe you have a fiscal deficit, but you have a current account balance or surplus. Same in Japan. US instead has a twin current account and fiscal deficit. So not only is borrowing, but it's borrowing from abroad. And when you borrow from abroad, you are, how to say, hostage to the kindness of strangers. If your creditor keep on financing you, you're okay. If they stop financing you for politics, geopolitics, economic, financial risk, then the shock can be bigger. So paradoxically, the exorbitant privilege, you know, it's like somebody who is drunk with access to a free bar can drink as much as they want. So eventually they become more drunk and they become sicker, right? So being able to finance yourself cheaply makes you more addicted to financing, debt, leveraging, risk-taking in a way that eventually make the crash harder. And the market discipline so far doesn't work for the US and the dollar.
Thank you. You mentioned a lot of countries today, and actually some people believe that there'll be a certain trigger or some accident in some countries, and then it will affect the worldwide economy badly. So why do you think that if this happened, that what country will be the potential risk, just at your point?
There are some small economies can have a very severe financial crisis, but of course they're not systemically important. You know, among emerging markets, Lebanon is bankrupt, Sri Lanka is bankrupt, Pakistan has debt problems, you know, eventually Argentina, Venezuela, you know, even Turkey could get into trouble, but they're not systemically important. I would say that the stuff that could have a global consequences, of course, if there was a, you know, hard landing of China. I'm not in the hard landing camp. I'm not in the soft landing camp. I think that things will be bumpy for China, but bumpy in a way that probably is damaging of global growth over time. And if I'm right that a combination of negative supply shocks, inflation still being persistent, hard landing of the real economy, stagflation, and inflation that forces central banks to keep interest rates higher, I think that the great moderation is over and the great stagflationary and debt instability regime is upon us. That's going to be a threat for the US, it's going to be a threat for Europe and other, you know, advanced economies. So all the major systemically important regions of the world, whether it's US or Europe or China, have a number of economic and financial fragility. And if they occur all at the same time, of course, that will have systemic effects for the world economy. Now, may not happen this year, maybe a slow motion train wreck, but I think that the trends for the next decade are going in the wrong direction.
Thank you. And we are Korean journalists, so we have to ask about the Korea. And I remember you said the Korean economy was not likely to experience hard landing in last year in May. You visited Korea. So do you still hold that view, or has it changed in some ways?
Well, you know, if the global economy were to experience a soft landing, say no recession, US, Europe, or a softish landing, say only a mild recession, couple of quarters short and shallow, then, you know, that's going to have an impact of slowing down growth in Korea compared to last year. You know, even the IMF is expecting a global slowdown in growth, and being a small open economy exporting a lot, slowdown of global growth, a slowdown of trade, a slowdown of exports, and it's occurring already to some extent. But you know, there'll be slowdown of growth. It's not going to be a great year, but you know, you're not going to have a recession. If instead, you know, a more hard landing scenario were to occur, where US, Europe go in a recession, and then Chinese growth slows down, then Korea's hurt. And of course, if that recession is associated with high commodity prices, you get the terms of trade shock. If associated with rising inflation, then you have to tighten monetary and fiscal policy, and that's going to imply the risk of a hard landing. And if then the Fed were to raise interest rates even more, the Korean War would weaken, the real value of your foreign currency debt rises, and to avoid a disorderly fall of the won, you might need a tightened monetary policy is going to cause more economic damage. So in a hard landing scenario, of course, you know, when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And when the US doesn't sneeze but has a pneumonia, of course you get global contagion. US is big enough, it can have that global impact. So in a true hard landing scenario, even an economy is quite strong macroeconomically, structurally, you know, it's still a success story by every dimension. And actually Korea is an innovative country where you're investing a lot in knowledge and the technologies of the future that are going to be important. So, you know, compared to other emerging markets, actually Korea is a much more resilient country, but in a global recession, everybody's hurt, including especially small open economies that are very much trade related. That will be the risk.